My name is Michelle Knoll, and I'm the president currently of the League in Pittsburgh. The podcast is named Strategies for Countering Myth and Disinformation, which is a timely topic in today's world. So I will leave our presenters, Ruth Quint, who is our webmistress, Eileen Olmsted, who produces our blast, and Amy Cleasis, who is our director of civic education, to enlighten us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Eileen Olmsted, and I'm the communications chair of the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh. My colleagues on this panel are Amy Cleasis, civic education director, and my co-presenter. And assisting us are Preston Scheimer, our VP for administration and treasurer, and Ruth Quint, our webmaster. They'll be helping with answering questions. We will also have a mystery guest for the question and answer period. The League of Women Voters, in partnership with the Algorithmic Transparency, have assembled a training to help us work to address mis and disinformation spreading in our community. We attended a training session to learn about this process, and now we're here to teach you what we've learned so we can work together to tackle this challenge. Before we get started, I'd like to walk us through today's agenda so we know what we will be covering. We will start with an exercise to get a sense of what brings everyone here today and understand what concerns we have about misinformation. Then we will give an overview of the landscape in which the work takes place. With that context, we will then explore how we define this complex problem, looking at the tactics, appeal, and motivation common to misleading messages. Once we establish that foundation, we will turn to thinking about when and how to engage responsibly to tackle problematic content. After we discuss responses, we can talk about participation through volunteer engagement, where we will explain how you can sign up to take an active part in collaborative action. So let's get started. Before we jump into the substance of today's training, we're going to participate in a brief exercise to share with one another what's on our mind about this topic. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to respond to this question in the chat. What concerns motivate you most to help your community address mis and disinformation? Check from the list, or maybe something else, and put it in the chat, please. Preston, what are people saying?
Eileen, they're coming in fast and furious. You'll have to give me a moment to.
Okay.
But I would say the gist of it is the concern that the outcome of the election will be compromised. Back to you, Eileen.
Thank you all for your participation. Misinformation spreading on social media has become a fact of life. It fuels polarization and hate. It drives down trust in institutions. It amplifies fringe science and conspiracies, and it incites violence sometimes. Every political and social issue we hope to address is now impacted by the threat of false and misleading claims that can confuse and radicalize the public. Unfortunately, this is a complex problem, and there is no silver bullet to solve it. Social media platforms and fact checkers can't moderate us out of this downward spiral, and no act of Congress can effectively restrict the flood of misinformation that is likely to continue unabated. We all share the responsibility for addressing misinformation. So instead, building capacity within our communities to establish resilience to the impact of misinformation is critical. If we cultivate a shared sense of civic responsibility for understanding and identifying harmful and misleading messages, and then invest energy in constructively engaging with one another, we can build the necessary bridges and find the common ground required to engage the whole of our society in an effort to improve our discourse. We are here today to realize this idea of a whole of society effort. Let's start by thinking about what that really means. It means acknowledging that we all share a responsibility to understand and address the misinformation corrupting our discourse. This cannot be passive. We need to internalize that it should be our civic duty to take an active role in improving our discourse and mitigating the harm caused by mis and disinformation. It means embracing that everyone can be affected by mis and disinformation regardless of their political perspective. It means recognizing that misinformation looks different in each community and we need to tackle it everywhere. Not, for example, just in white English-speaking spaces. Much of the attention paid to the spread of misinformation has focused on majority communities and mainstream English language concerns. To meaningfully tackle misinformation for our entire society, we must make a specific effort to address the unique ways it spreads in marginalized communities, as the substance can often be quite different. And these communities are frequently targeted directly with disinformation. Finally, it means striving to ensure that the messages and strategies intended to counteract these problems are generated by the people and in the places they're supposed to address. Effective community outreach and communications must be authentic and informed by unique circumstances facing a particular community. Effectively combating the challenges posed by mis and disinformation means that solutions cannot be imposed from the outside. Instead, we must empower those within a community to develop approaches that will resonate with them so they are both invested in the outcome and able to tailor their approach based on their unique cultural knowledge. As we think about addressing problematic messages, it is important to start by recognizing that the information that pollutes our discourse comes in many forms. Regardless of the form, it all misleads. For our purposes, the distinctions between these various forms are less critical than our awareness that in the end, the impacts they create are the main concern and the one we seek to address regardless of the intent of the messenger or specific language of the message. Everything that misleads is harmful. We must recognize that the problem is much bigger than a simple contrast between what is true and what is false. As you will see when we go through the various forms and tactics, much of the corrosive discourse sits in a gray area where things are difficult, if not impossible, to verify or fact check, and where an emotional appeal is more powerful than a logical one. This means that our response strategies cannot rely on communicating facts alone, but also tackle the appeal, motives, and context in which people share misleading ideas. Amy?
Thank you. So we're going to talk about understanding tactics and key forms of problematic content. But what do we actually mean when we talk about problematic content? First things first, we need to acknowledge that the kinds of messages that corrupt our discourse are not always the simple and obvious examples of what we used to call fake news or simply lies. Missing context. Beyond the outright falsehoods, the key areas of concern include messages that lack critical context, things like articles, statistics, charts, or even images that lack a critical piece of information might be incredibly misleading. We bucket this kind of content together under the label false or missing context. Without that context, It is just as wrong and likely as harmful as the completely made up stuff. We also see lots of arguments that are based on a faulty or illogical premise that can't be proven wrong, but nonetheless isn't right. This is a common tactic in political rhetoric and propaganda, but we see it cropping up frequently in image-based memes and short-form video content, setting up a straw man to tear down or trying to falsely equate things that just aren't comparable, corrupts our ability to build a constructive and honest discourse. Hate. We constantly see coded messages that are embedded with stereotypes and hate. In the end, every overt or covert expression of prejudice is founded on a kernel of misinformation. Hate speech is disinformation. And then there's conspiracies. While conspiracy theories have been around forever, the last few years have seen a massive rise in their prevalence and diversity across social media. At their core, conspiracies serve a role similar to some mythology, to give us fantastic and exciting answers to the difficult and confusing things that impact our lives. When we can't believe that our candidate lost, we can't understand how the entire world shut down in a matter of weeks due to an invisible plague, blaming powerful people with ulterior motives creates a story that matches the scale of our own confusion and frustration. And then there's old content. Finally, some of the simplest and most mundane content can be misleading even when it's totally accurate. We frequently see old content that was true at the time, but gets reshared again today in a new context. When we don't know that it's old, we don't realize it is no longer relevant to the current discourse, or worse, outright misleading. Above all, it is critical to recognize with each of these forms of content, it doesn't have to be false to create problems. Warning. Before we proceed, we need to pause to give you a clear warning about what we're about to show you. The content that follows are real examples of messages that have circulated online that contain some kind of problematic content. As you look at and think about each of these examples, please keep in mind that they risk misleading you right now. As we go through the examples, think about the forms and tactics critically to be sure you understand how and why they are misleading. So, tactics, missing context. And what is context? It's the background, they're the setting so that something is fully understood. Messages with missing or false context are widespread online. Anytime a quote is shared without the surrounding statements, or anytime an image is cropped in a manipulative way that misses context, makes the thing that was true into something that can mislead someone. In these cases, statistics can have that same problem. I'll read this and I want you to think about the message. It says, illegal aliens are far more likely to commit federal crimes based on statistics. They are 7% of the population, and yet they commit all of these crimes, including 22% of murders. So do you believe that? Is it true or false? Actually, these statistics are accurate for the year they were shared and are even backed up by government data. The one key phrase in this statement that makes it misleading is federal crimes, because these types of charges are rarely prosecuted at the federal level. Non-citizens are overrepresented in the federal crime data used to make this claim. Non-citizens make up a much smaller proportion of all criminal prosecutions, but that context is omitted here. As a result, statements like this can be both true and exceptionally misleading in ways that completely distort the conversation. And then there's Tim Allen with a false equivalence. So faulty logic or logical fallacies are also quite a common trait of misleading messages. They usually come in the form of an argument to convince you of something, but end up jumping to the wrong conclusion. In this case, we see a meme that uses a false equivalence argument to question the legitimacy of mail-in voting by suggesting it's the same as self-certifying that you have been vaccinated. It's illogical to compare the two, but this message exploits an underlying skepticism in one to critique the other. Other common fallacies include a red herring or straw man argument, and they misdirect your attention away from the real problem to an invented one. There are numerous other logical fallacies that show up in our discourse every day. Recognizing them requires breaking down the arguments you see, evaluating both the substance and the motivation, and taking a step back and considering whether the underlying premise is valid. And this one, Alabamans take a hit. This is hate and dog whistles. This viral meme doesn't use any overt derogatory language, but it's embedded with hate nonetheless. In this case, the point of the statement's pretty clear, but sometimes prejudice and othering messages can be subtle. We have to pay careful attention to messages that reference or allude to specific identities to determine if they are hateful dog whistles. And this is the felt tip pen conspiracy. Anytime a message begs a question, I'm just asking a question, or makes a claim that a particular situation is the result of decisions by powerful people with ulterior motives, it has the signature of a conspiracy theory. While some versions may be quite outlandish and featured in the news, there's a wider base of more mundane conspiracy theories that circulate frequently. They blame politicians, organizations, and other powerful individuals, often through questioning and innuendo, for every kind of problem society faces. Recognizing these subtle versions requires both vigilance and some fluency in the core ideas they employ. When specific powerful people are mentioned, or you recognize allusions to world domination or other sinister activities, you need to exercise skepticism and evaluate those ideas carefully. And old and out of date. Social media has made it particularly easy to confuse something recent with something out of date. Often, the original date something was published isn't shown when it gets reshared online. In this case, a news article from 2012 about voters in Florida was reshared days after the 2018 midterms. The story was from a reputable source and likely true at the time in the original context. However, when it was shared 6 years later in the context of a contentious recount fight in Florida, anyone who did not bother to read the article could easily be left with the impression that this story was contemporary. Checking the date when something was originally published is incredibly easy and a good habit to develop, especially when the subject is particularly inflammatory. So, I'd like to take a moment and share out which of these tactics that you see the most when you are online or in the news. So Preston, we're going to look at missing, just write in one word: context, logic, hate, conspiracy theories, or out of date.
You bet, and I'll try and count as best I can.
All right.
Well, Amy, I'd say the winners are going to be the issues of missing context, or it's pretty well spread. Conspiracy theories. The one that isn't so high up there that I thought might be is hate and dog whistles. So people are seeing a lot of this stuff.
Right.
Back to you.
Back to Eileen.
Back to Eileen, sorry.
What makes disinformation stick? Why do misleading messages work on us? There are many reasons, but some of the most potent explanations can be useful as we think about how to recognize misinformation when it appears in the wild. By learning how we are manipulated, we can develop our own resistance to the manipulation. There are three concepts we'll explore here: motivated reasoning, emotional appeals, and easy answers. Motivated reasoning. I had never heard this term before, so I'm learning too. We are predisposed to believe ideas that align with our own political beliefs and social values. When we learn that someone we don't trust or agree with may have done something bad, we are less likely to question the evidence because we already expected them to be guilty. These biases can also get us into trouble because they condition us to rationalize or ignore things which don't align with our views. When we evaluate what we're reading and hearing, we need to pay particular attention to whether or not a message plays to these biases as we look for and judge the evidence to support the idea. Just because we want something to be true doesn't mean it is. Misleading messages often strike an emotional chord with us. Usually they make us angry or fearful, but sometimes they also might make us happy or proud. Anytime we encounter a message that triggers a strong emotional response, we have to take a step back and consider why the message makes us feel that way, and if those emotions risk clouding our critical thinking. The most effective disinformation campaigns trigger powerful emotions that logic can be difficult to overcome. And as we discussed earlier, conspiracy theories frequently offer easy answers to difficult questions. Many types of misleading messages rely on easy answers to get you to jump straight to a particular conclusion. Whether it's about your pocketbook or misinformation, the same advice applies. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Frequently, a message can use 2 or 3 of these strategies at the same time. An emotional appeal can be made to make an easy answer easier to digest. Motivated reasoning can be potent because it also deals with a topic that makes you angry. These are features you will begin to notice appear in many of the misleading messages you encounter. Understanding motivation. Why do people create disinformation? Often it helps people to understand the motivations behind some forms of problematic content because it highlights for them how they might be getting manipulated or exploited. It also encourages them to engage and defend themselves. The last piece of the landscape we'll look at is the motivation of those who create and purposefully amplify disinformation. Determining motive based on something shared online or heard secondhand can be difficult to ascertain, but in some cases it is clear. Looking for obvious motives can be helpful in identifying campaigns of deception and overt efforts to mislead. Many bad actors are driven by a political agenda. They spread falsehoods and use the various tactics we have discussed earlier in service of a mission to achieve policy and electoral goals. Electing candidates, passing laws, and shifting public opinion towards the causes they support is their primary objective. We generally assume this is the dominant motive in the corrosive content we observe. However, a large proportion of those would perpetuate conspiracies, invent and distribute false information, and sow doubt and confusion are actually driven by profit. We often see these messages appear in support of direct funding appeals, product sales, and even efforts to drive traffic to generate advertising revenue. The revenue generated from spreading disinformation continues to grow and diversify. Finally, a subset of bad actors are what we often call trolls, who are motivated by the enjoyment they derive from generating disinformation. These are chaos agents who take pleasure in spreading conspiracies and hate in particular because it gives them attention and offers an outlet for their frustration. As we look to recognize the various forms of disinformation that get shared online, it is important to look for clues that might help us recognize the motivations of the disinformers as well. Understanding those motivations is particularly valuable as we think about the ways to inoculate against and respond to problematic content. As we will discuss next, identifying and exposing the underlying motivations of fear can increase the impact of responsible engagement to counter disinformation. Before we move on to responsible engagement, let's briefly recap what we have covered so far. This problem comes in many forms and deploys many distinct tactics. What we see frequently lives in the gray area between truth and lies and sticks because it plays on our biases, emotions, and desires for easy answers. When it is spread by bad actors, they are motivated by politics, profit, or the thrill of the pranks. Let's add one final piece of this problem. We can become part of it if we're not careful. Before we move into how to address misinformation, let's take one more moment to reflect on the kinds of subjects we see misinformation about. Think about something you've seen that might have been misleading or harmful recently. What subject was it about? Put your answer in the chat. Preston, what are you seeing?
Well, it's interesting. I'm seeing lots of comments about healthcare, vaccines. I'd say those were the two biggest ones. Some race and identity as well.
Great.
Amy.
Okay, back to you, Elaine.
All
Back to
right.
you, Amy.
All right. Just a friendly reminder, everyone should be muted. Thank you. So now that we have a clear understanding of the landscape and a detailed overview of what the problem looks like and why it exists, let's start to think about what we can actually do about it. Believe it or not, we'll start by talking about disengaging. A critical rule is in almost all circumstances, you should not engage with mis and disinformation or with the people who create and amplify it. We'll go through a range of ways to think about how and why you should not engage. And then we'll talk about the exceptions, the circumstances when we may want to carefully consider engagement. And then we'll talk about specific ways to think about effectively and responsibly messaging when you need to. And then we'll conclude this section by talking about how to use a structured conversation to think about more meaningful ways to build bridges with people who believe and share misinformation. So, when in doubt, do not engage. And I'll just say that again, when in doubt, do not engage. The first and most important guideline to consider when you encounter any kind of problematic content online or offline is that you should not engage. The risks and obstacles far outweigh any perceived benefits. There is a personal toll that you can experience if there's backlash against you, and there are social consequences you can't always predict. And critically, in some cases, your effort to respond can have the opposite of the intended effect and increase the reach and reinforce the potency of the falsehood that you're trying to address. Don't argue. In particular, you want to avoid some common mistakes we all naturally have a tendency to make. You don't want to argue. When you argue directly with someone and try to contradict them, they usually respond with defensiveness and get pushed deeper into their own corner and more fiercely defend the fallacy. This can have the adverse effect of actually increasing their belief in the misleading concept. In some cases, your disagreement can be perceived as evidence of the legitimacy of the rumor that they believe. Don't amplify. Online, any form of interaction with a falsehood can serve to amplify it. The systems that choose what content to recommend often disregard the difference between positive and negative engagement with a social media post and take any form of rewatching, commenting, and resharing as a signal that they should boost the reach of a piece of mis or disinformation. The last thing you want to do is help more people see something they wouldn't otherwise have seen when you were trying to squash or debunk it. Unfortunately, people often become unintentional spreaders of misinformation, even when they're trying to do something good. Don't repeat the language of the falsehood. When you attempt to talk about misleading ideas, disinformation, or conspiracy theories, it's challenging to do so without using the language of the people who created it. It's critical to avoid allowing a disinformer to define the terms. And when they do, you cannot repeat them or you let them control the terms of the conversation. This is especially important when it comes to the terminology used around the safety and integrity of our elections. You should not repeat the language used by those who seek to undermine the legitimacy of the democratic process, because their effort to define and repeat the terminology is also the effort to normalize the misleading and harmful ideas. Don't embarrass. When you interact with someone in real life or online, you need to avoid using words or approaches that would seek to or have the effect of embarrassing or ridiculing them. Similar to arguing, this usually has the opposite of the intended effect. While you may be frustrated or even shocked that someone else might believe something you feel is absurd or stupid, you cannot convince them otherwise by making them feel bad. And instead, again, your effort is more likely to backfire and reinforce their beliefs and make you an enemy at the same time. You can remember this one as Thanksgiving dinner gone wrong. Don't contradict with only a fact check. There's a popular trend to respond to misinformation by sharing a fact check. While good information is always a valuable tool to counteract bad information, when you deploy it casually without context or in a manner that can be perceived as condescending, it can also prove fruitless. For common themes and narratives of mis and disinformation, there's an embedded skepticism for the institutions that produce fact checks. This is yet another case where the fact check can actually serve as evidence to some that the falsehood they believe is true. From their perspective, if a source they are already skeptical of debunks the idea they believe, that can further convince them of its truthfulness. Fact checks and the people that produce them are a critical piece of the effort to counteract and build resilience to mis and disinformation. To make the best use of this resource, it's often better to read the fact check yourself. Think about what it teaches you about the motivations and gaps in knowledge that are exposed, and use this knowledge to help you avoid similar messages in the future, or communicate positively about the topic in a way that educates rather than demeans. This may seem redundant at this point, but it cannot be stated enough. Before you consider how to respond, you should always consider if you should respond. If you are in doubt about the risks, the answer is always do not engage, do not respond. Eileen.
Before we talk about how to actually engage responsibly, we need to think about what circumstances make it appropriate to consider attempting to respond. When a rumor, conspiracy theory, or some other type of problematic narrative has crossed a threshold where it has become well known, widely discussed, or is clearly no longer isolated to a small community, that idea has crossed a tipping point. In many cases, we try to quantify this tipping point using online engagement. Once a video has more than 1 million views, for example, the real tipping point depends on the community and the potential reach of the topic. So deciding when something has crossed a tipping point becomes subjective. However, a good way to think about the tipping point is, can this narrative no longer be contained? If so, it likely deserves a response. An example here would be a piece of content that is circulating widely on multiple social media platforms, generating news coverage, or is being discussed frequently across conversations within a community. When a particular piece of misinformation demonstrates a gap in knowledge, a question that lingers unanswered, we can think of that as a data deficit. This often occurs when there is legitimate demand for information on a subject, but you can only find low-quality information when you search for it. If you can identify a clear data deficit exposed by problematic content, then that represents a good candidate for response. The goal here is to fill that data deficit with good information rather than repeating the falsehood, which is both safer and more productive. There are numerous data deficits around how election security is maintained, which have given rise to a range of misinformation and conspiracy narratives that undermine confidence in the system. Tackling these data deficits within your community can be a key focus for meaningful engagement. In some cases, you may find yourself in a situation where misinformation creates a concrete obstacle in the real world. Registering voters or participating in the voting process are obvious examples. In these situations, a falsehood may need to be addressed in the moment to actually overcome that obstacle. In these circumstances, it is critical to recall the guidance about how not to engage, particularly the advice about avoiding arguments and embarrassing others. Structured conversations, which we'll talk about in a moment, can be particularly useful in these situations. Spoiler alert, the following strategies require preparation and thought rather than being off the cuff. So you do have to do your homework. Pre-bunking has become a key strategy to combat misinformation. A pre-bunk is a message designed to inoculate someone against a particular misinformation narrative or tactic, so they're more resilient to it, much in the same way that a vaccine inoculates us against a virus. Helping people develop this immunity to misinformation requires carefully identifying, crafting, and communicating a message that can effectively pre-bunk a bad idea without the risk of amplifying it. This set of tips, originally designed for journalists, is a useful checklist to follow when you want to embark on pre-bunking as a counter-messaging strategy. Start by figuring out what the data deficit is you want to tackle and carefully choose an example that is easy and safe to communicate. Build your message by starting with the truth. Make sure you warn the audience that you're going to talk about a falsehood. Provide some detail to explain the actual problem you're tackling. Describe the tactic used to mislead and close the message by restating the true information bolstered by evidence to justify how you know what you know. Make your message simple and shareable and make it available where the people impacted are likely to see it. This is the strategy we used when we created the video Journey of an Official Election Ballot in order to fully explain and pre-bunk what happens before, during, and after a voter completes a ballot. This popular video can be found on our Explainers and Graphics webpage, along with all the other educational resources and web pages we have created at www.lwvpgh.org. Amy.
This is yours. You can do this beginning here.
When the right criteria has been met for engaging in counter messaging, and you have a specific problem you need to address, this structure for message can be a useful way to think about designing that communication. It mirrors the tips we just outlined and follows a basic structure. Begin and end your message with the facts. Be sure to warn the audience before you describe the problem, and make sure to explain how the message is misleading by describing the tactics it uses, the reasons why it's persuasive, and if possible, explain the motives of those who created it.
So we've nicknamed this a fact sandwich, and Ruth and I would like to provide an example of this directly from the source document, which is the Debunking Handbook from George Mason University. Ruth.
Are you seeing the page now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, well, we're going to give you an example of the recommended way to present your factual argument. And unless you think very fast on your feet, this is a method you would use in a presentation, a letter to the editor, a news article, rather than in a spontaneous face-to-face conversation. So to present my fact, I would say scientists see human fingerprints all over our climate. There are many lines of evidence. Rising CO2 levels have been tracked for decades and predicted for over a century. Even though the atmosphere is now warmer at the surface, satellites measure less heat radiating back into space because it's not escaping from the CO2 greenhouse. The ocean is becoming measurably warmer and more acidic. Biologists are seeing effects of warming on plants, animals, and ecosystems. So in other words, you lead with a short, sticky summary of your position, provide a variety of information to fill a knowledge gap and also to show the breadth of the evidence, making it clear that it's not a simple he said, she said argument over a single question.
So then we'll do the myth, and you warn that the myth is coming, and then you repeat the misinformation only once and directly prior to the correction. So here's the myth. Common climate myth is that climate has always changed naturally in the past, and therefore modern climate change must be natural also. Ruth.
And this is obviously a fallacy. So we're going to explain how the myth misleads. What fallacy is it? And then point out the logical, the illogicalness of the argument. So this argument makes a logical error called the single cause fallacy. So imagine you see a dead squirrel in the middle of the road. Sure, squirrels have been dying of natural causes for centuries before cars were even invented, but that doesn't mean that's what happened here. The evidence may still point to a run-in with a car.
Pretty funny. So then you finish by reinforcing the fact, and you repeat the fact as many times as you can. Just as a detective finds clues in a crime scene, scientists have found many clues in climate measurements confirming humans are causing global warming. And then again, human-caused global warming is a measured fact. So that's a fact sandwich. Thanks, Ruth. And now I'm going to explain structured conversations, another strategy. And this one involves asking questions, showing empathy, exploring motives, and sharing perspective. Whoops, the other way. We're in the wrong. There you go. When circumstances permit, active and structured conversations can be a valuable approach to addressing misinformation within your community, particularly when there's more time and possibly the opportunity to engage face-to-face, and possibly when you already have a relationship with someone. So a meaningful structured conversation starts with openness and a sincere effort to understand someone else's perspective, and that's key. Begin by asking questions to help you learn what someone else believes and why these beliefs are important to them. Be sure to show trust and empathy so that you can establish the shared values you have and your honest desire to understand the fears someone else has. As you delve into the specifics, maintain a focus on the motives of those who created the messages rather than the person you're speaking with, so that you're not alienating them. Be sure to share your own perspective in a way that describes your personal experience, how you learned what you learned, and why you find it meaningful. This structured conversation strategy builds on all the advice that we've reviewed in this counter messaging section. Effective structured conversations avoid arguments and demeaning language. They don't rely solely on the authority of outside voices like news organizations or fact checkers, and instead build on personal experience. And remember, our personal stories are powerful. This approach can be complicated and doesn't always work in the moment, but when you demonstrate and sincerely feel respect and empathy, you're more likely to build trust that will have a lasting impact. So Ruth and I are going to role play an example of a structured conversation that takes place between two neighbors. And you may have had some of these conversations yourself. Ruth.
Amy, isn't it awful that today's generation is being taught to hate the country?
So I'm going to ask questions. Wow, not sure I understand what you're saying. What makes you think that?
Well, I saw it on the news that kids are teaching kids to criticize America. Even some parents don't see America as the great country that it is.
So now empathy. I will have to guess that you mean people you disagree with politically, like me, are teaching their children to hate the country. Is that it?
Yeah, that's it.
More empathy. If I believed that, I would probably be pretty upset too. But from my own experience, I really don't think this is happening.
Well, maybe some are not teaching children to hate the country, but are teaching children not to love the country.
And now explore motives. Maybe, but don't you think that news stories like this are just trying to get us to fight with each other?
Maybe, but I still feel that my values are under attack.
Can I share my story with you? My own experience in schools makes me feel that most people are teaching their children to love our country, but we have different ways of talking about it, especially if we're on different sides of the aisle.
Maybe, but I still feel that I can't say what I think without some people jumping down my throat.
I hear you. Wouldn't it be great if we could just talk to each other instead of making cartoon villains out of the other side?
Yeah, it sure would.
End of role play. All right, so we're almost there. Let's talk a little bit about the League's effort to counter mis and disinformation. So this last part of the training is about what you can do today to help build resilience to misinformation for yourself and to contribute to your community. Effectively spotting mis and disinformation when you see it online or in your community is a skill that requires practice. Learning to do it quickly and accurately takes time and effort. The League of Women Voters has partnered with the Algorithmic Transparency Institute on a program called Civic Listening Core to give you the opportunity to find and report problematic content when you see it so that you can practice these new skills and so that you can benefit the broader efforts to combat misinformation across the country. And let me say a little bit about this ATI, Algorithmic Transparency Institute. They focus on the impact of civic discourse. They develop tools, collect data, and supporting analyses that further a shared understanding of the role of digital media in the spread of problematic content and other adverse impacts on society. So, recognizing and reporting, the Civic Listening Program continues this training you've begun today by going into greater detail on the common forms and tactics used to spread misinformation. This volunteer program operates on a shift-based model where you sign up to commit 1 or more hours dedicated to the task of listening to the discourse in your own social media feeds or elsewhere online to find instances of problematic content that are circulating. You then flag that content and submit it to a shared repository and describe the problem that you identified with it. Okay, train, listen, and report. So what are the benefits of civic listening? Resilience, situational awareness, and accountability. Over time, by participating in this process, you can help achieve multiple goals at once. For yourself and your community, the act of finding and flagging problematic content helps you build the resilience we seek directly. You learn to recognize common types of messages and gain an awareness of the most recent and popular strategies used to mislead people. This makes you less susceptible yourself, and it arms you with the knowledge and personal experience that you can use to communicate with others to share your resilience. At the same time, you will benefit the broader community of organizations who are working together to combat mis and disinformation by sharing what you see locally with others all across the country to establish a foundation of situational awareness that can support communications and inoculation messaging. And finally, by comprehensively identifying and documenting the problems we encounter, we can identify and take action based on the patterns that we see. Bad actors can be exposed, and the social media platforms that enable them to amplify falsehoods can be held accountable. Participating in the Civic Listening Corps gives you the opportunity to participate in realizing this vision of a whole of society response to combating mis and disinformation. And you can start today. 2 ways to participate. First, you can take out your mobile phone right now. Take out your mobile phone, open the app, the camera app, or if you have the QR code app, and point it at this QR code. When you scan it, your device will ask you if you would like to add the League of Women Voters tip line to your address book. I did it. It's very easy. And then I'll ask you to save that contact. And if you do, you will essentially bookmark these contacts on your device. Then the next time you encounter something problematic online, you will have an instant means for flagging that content into this shared repository. As you scroll through any social media app, you can choose to click the share button for something you found online that looks problematic. But instead of amplifying it within that platform, you can share it via a text message to this tip line you just added to your device so that our community is made aware of it. Then the second way you can participate is by signing up to join the League's effort at the Civic Listening Corps. Visit this link in your browser, and we're going to throw it up in the chat. By participating, where am I? Okay. Visit this link in your browser or phone and confirm your interest, and you will be invited to the next Civic Listening Corps training and get updates on listening shifts that you can sign up for. By actively participating in this process, you can help the League understand and combat the misinformation that is affecting your community and likely other communities as well. And we have this resource sheet actually on our explainers and graphics webpage, and we're going to throw that into the chat, the link to that page. And all of these resources are just terrific. And there is the link for the Listening Corps at the bottom. So thank you for listening to this training. And now we're going to begin our Q&A. So please start putting your questions into the chat. Our panel of Eileen, Amy, and Ruth will answer as many questions as time allows, and Preston will field our questions. But first, I would like to introduce our mystery guest, Ms. Beth Hoffman, a new League member who is part of Pitt Cyber. Shout out to Pitt Cyber folks, and has a few words for us. Beth will also be available for Q&A. Beth.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here tonight. As Amy mentioned, my name is Beth Hoffman. I'm currently a postdoctoral associate at Pitt Public Health, and I'm also a member of Pitt Cyber. I first joined the League of Women Voters after my grandma passed in 2019, and in going through her things, I came across newspaper clippings that discussed her membership in the League going back to the 1960s. More recently, I was inspired to reach out and become more involved as a way to honor my younger sister, Emily, who was tragically killed last month. Some of you may have heard about the pedestrian that was struck while crossing the 5 Points intersection in Point Breeze, and that was her. And becoming involved in the League of Women Voters, specifically their initiatives around education and civic engagement, feels like a very fitting way to honor Emily because she had a profound impact on me in these areas. She got me hooked on the TV show The West Wing, which awakened in me a curiosity about civics and politics. And she was also very active herself in addressing mis and disinformation in her life. In addition to all that, one of the reasons I'm speaking to you tonight is because a great deal of my research in public health looks at mis and disinformation on social media, mostly around vaccines. I began this work in 2017 after a local pediatric practice, Kids Plus Pediatrics, was the victim of a coordinated global anti-vaccine attack because of a video they made about the HPV vaccine as cancer prevention. I led a study that looked at who was behind these comments, and we found that social media was facilitating the coordination of anti-vaccine activists, and that these activists were very skilled at targeting their messages to their audience. Now, fast forward about a year later to the COVID-19 pandemic, where we continued to see targeted disinformation about COVID-19 vaccines. As talked about tonight, oftentimes one of the motives behind disinformation is financial. And I want to highlight a March 2021 report by the Center for Countering Digital Hate that found that almost 3/4 of anti-vaccine content posted or shared on Facebook, most of it anti-COVID vaccine content, was attributed to 12 individuals deemed the Disinformation Dozen. One of the reasons why the Disinformation Dozen has yet to be taken off many social media platforms is because their presence is worth about $1 billion to these platforms. But interestingly enough, this report also found that organizations associated with 9 of the Disinformation Dozen received more than $1.5 million in federal loans through the Paycheck Protection Program, despite having annual revenues of over 36 million, and that these individuals often collaborate with each other to market disinformation and boost sales of their products, such as vitamin supplements and other COVID cures. So I wanted to highlight this report because, as we've talked about tonight, there's often a financial motive, and encouraging people to think critically about this can be a pretty powerful way at addressing disinformation. And bringing this all back to my sister's passion for civic engagement, although vaccine disinformation gets a lot of attention, there's a lot of other health mis and disinformation on social media, often around politically charged topics. For example, a recent study examining discourse about IUDs and other forms of birth control on TikTok found that almost 1/4 contained inaccurate information, and much of this seemed to be particularly geared toward young people who might live in states recently most affected by the Dobbs decision. So we can't really disentangle health misinformation and disinformation anymore from political mis and disinformation. It's all something we need to work on addressing. So thank you for listening to me. I'm excited to be here and be part of the Q&A, and looking forward to further talking with you all about media literacy, civic education, disinformation, and the West Wing.
Thank you, Beth. Do we want everyone to turn on their cameras now? Is that the idea?
No, I don't think so. I think we're
No?
going to stay the way we are for the
Stay the way
benefit
we
of the video.
Okay.
But I don't have anybody typing questions yet. So then you're stuck with me giving you one. So we had a couple that came in advance as part of the registration process. And here's one that kind of relates to what Beth was talking about. Is there specific ways that you can work with misinformation through the commenting part of social media, where somebody posts something and then there's the comments that follow? Anybody have any advice on that one?
Well, the first piece of advice would be don't engage unless you really know what you're doing. So the good advice would be to report it to somebody like the Civic Listening Corps, so that they can gather information and use it to help pre-bunk and do things like that. One thing that people don't realize is if you see a meme on social media that's from a public account, like it could be from I Love Memes Facebook page or something, and you respond to it to try to debunk it, that instantly puts it all across all of your friends' screens. And the other thing is that there will be bots on that comment thread who jump in to disagree with you and create a lot more traffic and a lot more money for whoever is publishing that and getting paid by the view. So it's very easy to make that mistake. But if it is your friend who has posted it on their page and you have a little bit of social capital to spend there, I would spend it and do a structured conversation. What do you mean by that? What makes you think that? See what happens.
We have a couple of slides on bots on the resource page too, because it wasn't part of this presentation.
And actually, another question coming in is the role that you can have in posting relevant links on social media as a way of dealing with misinformation. What are your thoughts about that? I bet you better be careful about those links. Are they really good?
Well, I would say more than posting a link, because, and everybody else, please jump in here, but if you post something like, how many of us have had this conversation? Somebody posts something that you know is not true. So you're like, no, that's not true. Look, here's the article on Snopes that says it's not true. And they say, oh, Snopes is biased. I don't believe Snopes. That's it, shut down, end of the conversation. So instead of posting a link to an article, like it said in this presentation, maybe read the article yourself, digest the argument, look at some of the background sources that were in that article, and come at it from the original source. Like, come at it from, you know what, I looked at that original speech, that video of that original speech, and that's not what I thought I heard them saying. Or I read that court document and it says this and not that. And then it's not like, oh, New York Times, I don't believe that. Or no, it's Breitbart, I don't listen to Breitbart. You want to say it from yourself to somebody that you know. And if you don't know them, forget it. Don't say anything, nothing.
Here's one dealing quite locally with Allegheny County. How successful do you think that the elections department of Allegheny County, as well as the state, have been in combating misinformation and disinformation?
I think that the Allegheny County Elections Division has done an excellent job. They allowed you to subscribe to a newsletter that is very informative and it keeps people very up to date. They have a very well-designed website where you can find answers, FAQs, all kinds of references to how an election should be run, answering questions, and equally so with the State Department, the PA elections thing. I think they've done a really good job, and they're constantly updating their information. So I would say we refer people to both of those when we don't have an exact answer, or maybe when we want to have people read the official line, because maybe they don't believe what the League of Women Voters say, but they will believe what the Department of Elections or the Division of Elections in Allegheny County tells them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this past year in particular, the Department of State put out a nice infographic about how long was it going to take to count all the ballots. And they put it out like 3 weeks ahead of the election to say, because of these things, if you see it coming in slowly, this is why we're expecting this to happen and that to happen. And it really, I think, did help put a lid on some of the confusion that leads to the conspiracies about why it's not counted on time.
This is kind of a question probably for Ruth, because I think she can answer it. But how do you determine if a website is legitimate?
What?
In other, obviously, they're thinking about websites that resemble, let's say, something official, but they're not. But what would you do?
You would look at who's publishing it, and you can, any official website will have an about us source, so we'll have their contact information, and make sure you are where you think you are. I mean, I don't think there are very many organizations that are actually trying to spoof a legitimate organization, but there might be some, like, the Center for Vaccine Research or something, that make up their own organization, and they look like they're legit, but if you go up and you look at their board of directors and try to track any of them down, they're all supplement salesmen.
I was going to add to that actually, when somebody said that, I thought of the National Vaccine Information Center, which is a .org and sounds very non-biased, but is actually an anti-vaccine organization. And sometimes just popping into Google something like, what do others say about this, or just searching, and then you can find what other groups are saying and use that to help make your judgment about if it's a reputable source or not.
Right. There is another option too, and on some browsers, you can go to the little dots on the right-hand side, and you can ask for the source page, and that reveals the HTML coding. And when you can see the coding, you can more easily see who might be actually behind it because of the source page. But talking about sources, there's obviously some folks in our audience who are academics. And so this question deals with how do you break the cycle about people saying that academics cannot be trusted?
I always think of surgeons. Yeah, I don't want my surgeon to go to school because they're elite. I mean, sorry, I had to throw that in there.
I'd rather have the local blacksmith operate on me.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. They love experts as long as it's they choosing the expert, but if it's an academic, and academics have different points of view and they have different levels of education. So if you really want to find out about an academic's history, Google them, because they will be in Google's database, believe me, and you can see their work. You can see what their specialties are, how much they have published, what their peers think about them. You can find out about specific academics.
There's obviously your play acting created some thought about the Thanksgiving issues at the table at Thanksgiving dinner, because there's a couple of questions dealing with, it's part of sources, but how do you deal with populations or people you encounter who are basically getting their sources from basically that are set up to misinform, and they've attracted these audiences, and you're now confronted with the fact that that's all they know.
Once again, like my normal strategy is to try to bring up the issue of like, well, I heard this and you heard that, and they can't both be true. So how do we find out? How do we dig down? Can we find an original source, the original police officer report of this event happening, or is there a video of this happening? Where can we both agree and start from there? Because your side may think one thing, my side might think another thing, but there's got to be a way to come together and find somewhere where we can agree. And usually a lot of times when I'm having these discussions, with some of my family members who are on the other side of the aisle, and they'll be telling me something like, I couldn't believe how rude this speaker was to someone on my side. And they said this, and they were really criticizing them for this or that. And I say, that really surprises me. I would be sorry to hear that. Can you show me the speech? And a lot of times, they go back, they look for the speech, and that's not in the speech. And they sort of like back off. Oh, well, that's not the part I heard about, but they heard a characterization of the speech from a commentator. And maybe I heard a characterization of a speech from the other commentator, but when we look at the speech, we realize that this issue is being kind of fluffed up by one side or the other. So a lot of times if you challenge them, let me see something more neutral. Once you find it, the whole argument falls apart. So
there's at this point you have reached the point where there's no more questions. So I'd like to ask one for myself.
I see some commentary. How do you deal with misinformation shared on news sources that are one-sided and may use?
I paraphrased that one, Eileen, and asked.
Pardon me?
I already paraphrased that question and linked it with
another.
Well,
I was gonna say something about that.
Good.
I think that the best thing is learning which news medias reflect what points of view. And try to channel surf and listen to different people talking about the same issue, or maybe avoiding talking about the issue. But there's nothing really that we can do to stop that. I mean, unfortunately, the airwaves are free, and if they're making money from a particular point of view, that's what they're going to do. And it happens on the left and on the right, not just on the right.
So I have no more questions.
Comments?
Well,
I
I've had a number of comments about the quality of the presentation. You're doing a great job. We like what you're saying. Terrific program.
I would like to answer Alan. He asked a question about, other than Allegheny County and Philadelphia, how have other county election divisions done combating misinformation? Actually, Alan, that's a very good question. There are many election departments out there that are very, very small. They may have only 2 or 3 employees, and they're completely overwhelmed. And they may not even have a good web page. I don't know exactly, but I read very close to the election how difficult it was for some of these smaller counties or rural counties to keep up with what they had to do just to get the election done, let alone combating misinformation. I would say that if I were in their shoes, I would probably refer people to those websites that do have good information, like the state website. But I think that probably there's a wide disparity in the state on the ability of some counties to respond to misinformation.
I don't know whether we like to ask one to Beth specifically because of her Pitt cyber work, but is cyber working on any kind of a silver bullet that's going to go in and analyze software and communications and solve all the problems?
Well, I wish I could say that there is a silver bullet. One of the things that is interesting is, if you look back at history, mis and disinformation has always been a problem. In fact, related to vaccines, you look at when we had variolation in the 1700s, and Ben Franklin's older brother created a tabloid magazine that was basically devoted to promoting anti-variolation sentiment. In those days, however, it just took a lot longer for that information. It takes a lot longer to print pamphlets and leaflets than it does to send out a tweet. So I think the silver bullet is changing human nature, which I don't think that we're going to be able to do. But I will say that a lot of our work is focused on things like media literacy, teaching people how to critically examine their sources, teaching people science literacy, data literacy, all of the things we talked about in this presentation, but trying to make sure that starting in elementary school, this is really being worked into the curriculum and all levels, and realizing that it's not an issue of left or right or wrong. It's an issue that's really permeating in all facets of society. So it really comes back to this media literacy education and kind of teaching us all to be more critical examiners of the media we consume.
I think too, if you look at the motivation behind some of the political and the trolling content, it's really to divide us and to rip apart the fabric of the community. And so in our response, instead of focusing on this fact and this, you're wrong about this, we need to concentrate on rebuilding that social fabric, building back up that sense of community, so that having a structured conversation where you're saying, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. Do you want to listen to a story about what my experience was? Trying to stop that cycle of anger and escalation.
Exactly.
And then that's when you can educate and actually exchange an idea or a fact.
And I kind of demonstrated how you talked about human nature, how it's in a flippant way, an answer to the serious question about people, the academics, and not being trusted. I was an educator and I experienced it firsthand, and yet I had this rather flippant attitude that someone called me out on, which I appreciate, because it's true. You know, you have to stop and think about this stuff and react to what the person's feeling, not to their words. So, you know, why does someone not trust an expert? Why is that a bad thing? And so, you know, to me, so many of the answers aren't, social media would overwhelm me. I don't do social media, but I just feel like one-to-one, you know, the tide is turning a bit. I feel like we're seeing more people who are tired of the sides, and maybe it's just gotten too extreme. I don't know. That's my own personal opinion. I'm not the League of Women Voters. But, you know, I think human nature aside, it's our human nature to think of the words and get all in. But if we look at people and respond to people, then that's the part of the solution. I think I'm kind of going along with what Ruth said.
There's an interesting comment from Glenn Nelson, because he's suggesting that it's easier sometimes to teach people how to find good information than to change their minds. So which does, at least it gives them the opportunity to go and in their own private way look at the information without having to deal with you telling them that it was this way.
And that gives me an entry into what I want to say, which is encouraging everybody who's interested in digging into the weeds on this and down deep is to go to our webpage, because Amy and Ruth and some of our other members have done a fantastic job of putting up videos, infographics, and all kinds of powerful and interesting and well designed information for people who are looking for something that is unbiased and answers their questions. And so I'd like to encourage people to do that. And thank you for the entry.
And I would like to say too, that when you're having one of these arguments with somebody, it helps me to tell myself it's not a game, it's not a chess match that you're trying to make the right moves to win. It's not a boxing match, hopefully, either. It's a conversation, and your goal isn't to convert them to your way of thinking in one conversation, or to get them to concede your point exactly, because it takes time and space for somebody to really change their mind. I don't know, I can't remember ever saying like, oh, I had this conversation with my cousin on the other side of the aisle, and now I totally have changed my mind about my political stance. It takes a while to think, you know what, maybe he had a point, and I'll think about that next time before I make another statement like that. And it sort of opens that door. It takes a long time to really change a point of view. So in one conversation, you're not going to get somebody to vote your way or to change their whole view. But over time, it can happen within a relationship. And I would like to plug a book. I'm not plugging it because it's not mine, but it's called Rising Out of Hatred. And I forget the author, but it was about Derek Black, who was the son of the guy who runs Stormfront. And he had a white nationalist podcast with his dad, and then renounced that whole thing and became outspoken in the cause of diversity now. And it took him years to do it. And this is a memoir, and he literally had to go to Europe, and he was actually living in David Duke's Paris apartment while he had the time and space to change his mind and go back and re-engage with his community, because he had to give up a whole community in order to change his mind. So it's a hard thing to do, and you need to give people a safe place to do it. And you can be the safe place if you do it right.
I think one thing also along those lines to remember is nobody likes to be told that they're wrong or thinking wrong, and so I think the more that we can engage with empathy, and especially in those in-person conversations, not necessarily the ones on social media, but remember that oftentimes people are trying to make the best decisions they can, and they're many times a victim of a poor information environment. We see this especially with health topics. People who have been targeted by the, disinformation dozen with vaccine disinformation. And so I think really in coming from that standpoint of people are scared, people that, again, that human nature, people make decisions based on fear. And the more we can, encourage people kind of to shift their mindset and shift the way they look at the information they consume, as opposed to saying you're wrong, I think can help change the dynamic around these interactions.
Oh, and
Nancy Pozell has a question. I don't know if she doesn't want to put it in her. Nancy, I saw you pop up.
I think we could let people turn
like
on
to-
their
I do too. Let's turn on the
their
cameras.
cameras now. We could actually have a chat and we could
I'd
cut
like to
this out
see
of it.
everybody. I'd like
Yeah,
to see
turn on your-
everybody.
Turn on your camera.
Turn on your cameras.
Turn mine off because I got to fix something here.
There's our faces.
I saw Nancy Pozell pop up and she had her hand up, and now I don't see her.
Jeez.
You people have dropped out.
Yeah.
We had a very good showing tonight.
Okay.
The name of the book that you mentioned,
The name of what?
name of the book.
The
that you
book,
men-
the book.
Oh, the name of the book that I mentioned, it's called Rising Out of Hatred.
Thank you.
And let's see it. And it's not by Derek Black, it's by Eli Saslow, Saslow.
Saslow.
Really interesting memoir.
I saw him speak.
Somebody
Question?
made a documentary called The Brainwashing of My Dad, or How My Dad Was Brainwashed. And it was very interesting because it talked about elderly people who are alone and turn on the TV and listen to the same stuff day after day. And this gentleman had changed his point of view on many of his ideas from when he was younger. And his family discovered that he was listening to one particular TV station, and they gradually weaned him away from it. A little bit of deception took place, and he came back to what he had, to his old self in terms of his opinion. So it really is a powerful statement about how when people are alone and they don't have other people to interact with or to talk with, and they're listening to a certain kind of information all the time, they don't even realize that their opinions are changing or becoming that way. He wasn't aware of what had happened to him.
I wanted to say just a word about students. We find that young people, high school, college, they're totally informed about all of this. Some of the librarians are using the news literacy network Checkology for students, specifically for students, and that makes us hopeful because it doesn't, at least from our experience, what we've seen, they don't seem as susceptible to, they kind of laugh about what their parents are listening to. This one, the one young lady said, "I can't believe what my father believes," or something like, so they seem more tuned into accurate information. And I think some of them are getting it from school links to news literacy network for one. So
I read a good book this year called High Conflict by Amanda Ripley. It was on the New York Times bestseller list, and it talks about the sort of divisive disputes and how to kind of extricate yourself from that, and how to look at yourself in terms of what your role is and others. And it's uses an interesting term, conflict entrepreneurs, people who really thrive on stirring the pot. And it's an interest, it's an easy, quick read as well.
Yeah, sometimes you don't realize when you're being manipulated into just generating views for somebody. And I have one friend who does knitting, and sometimes she posts knitting patterns. And one time she posted something, I thought she had posted it, but she had commented on a public page like, oh, this pattern, I would like totally look terrible in this. And I made a joke about the pattern. And I got all of these, you know, people liking the joke, but there was these one or two people, I thought people, who would say, why would you even say something negative? If you don't like it, just move on. And I thought, oh, I'm sorry I upset them, but I just ignored it. Well, a week later, the person posts the same response again. And then a week later, the person posts the same response again. And it was just a bot trying to gin up more discussion on this knitting post. It was knitting. It wasn't even politics. So you really have to like be aware of like who's using you for what, you know?
Well, some of these bots are even, they're not coming from humans. They're artificial intelligence, and they're just reacting to certain words or certain phrases, and so they keep repeating it. I noticed this. I'm not on Twitter very often, but I noticed a particular person had a name and a description of what that person did, what his job was, but the lines that kept popping up, and it was popping up every 2 or 3 comments. People were engaging with him, they were very angry, but it was clear after about 4 or 5 comments that this wasn't a human being. This was just a machine trying to stir people up and get angry, so that people would say nasty things. And it was really, I had never really been aware of it as I was that day, where I just happened to get on I was looking at a particular string or something. Somebody asked about what book we used. Yeah.
I answered it in the chat.
Okay, I have some. I also, did you put it on the Algorithmic Transparency Organization?
Yes, I
So
did.
yes, this presentation was not developed by Amy and myself and Ruth and Preston. We were very lucky to attend a training, to go to a convention last year. We saw this gentleman do the presentation, and later the National League gave everybody the opportunity to go to be trained on this. And I think they're going to do more training, but I'm not sure when.
And if you were asking what was the page that we showed during the middle of the presentation, that was the debunking handbook with the fact sandwich from George Mason University, and it's in the resource list that's posted on our website.
It'll be posted on our website, and also the
It is already.
presentation will be on YouTube.
Okay, well, it's 8:30.
Yeah.
Time flies.
Thank you all for being here. It's great to see so
Thank
many faces, and hope come back again for our next. We're going to do something great in April on 11th. We have a presentation. Judy, maybe you can tell them a little bit about it. It's from the Modern Courts.
Yeah, Pennsylvanians for Modern Courts, and it's going to be about how to evaluate all about judicial candidates, because there are a lot of statewide judicial positions open, but half of everybody's magisterial district judge slots will be open. So it's going to be how to evaluate judicial candidates, and Pennsylvanians for Modern Courts are running it. If you go to our homepage, there's in the calendar, it'll have a link that you register, and then Pennsylvanians for Modern Courts. As soon as you register, actually, you get the Zoom link. So that's next. I think April 13th. Does that sound right?
I don't know, I have to look at the webpage, people.
Yeah, it's on the webpage.
On our homepage.
April 13th is correct.
April 13th, 7 to 8:30. And Pennsylvanians for Modern Courts do a great job.
Yeah.
They're
Read your
also,
blast, read your blast if you're a lead member.
and if not, just go to our website and the calendar on the homepage.
And the voters should be out in the, maybe tonight. I only have to proofread it at this point.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
All right, good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody, for
everybody.
participating. Thank you.
Thank you.